opioids. One of the hottest topics in pharmacy and medicine in the last 10 years or so, at least in the United States. You're probably somewhat familiar with opioids and the opioid crisis if you've taken other courses in the College of Pharmacy, but this is a topic we obviously have to talk about in a class like this, where the ethics of these kinds of situations seems like exactly the sort of subject matter that we should be concerned with. So I will have a lot more to say about Travis Reeder's book In Pain and the 3 chapters that you're assigned to read for it. Only 2 of those are assigned for this week, and then the last chapters 4 and 6 this week, chapter 7 next week. I will talk about the book as a whole in a lecture next week. For this short little lecture, I just want to focus on the background to the opioid crisis. Travis's case, where he was essentially given a large quantity of opioids and then not given the proper resources to reduce his dosage and get off the medication without serious adverse effects. It's just one of thousands of cases, thousands upon thousands of cases that have taken place in the United States over the last decade or so. And there are other examples of it. There are situations where people who need opioids can't get them. People who can get them in too high a quantity. They are given much larger doses than they need. There are some people like Travis who are sort of abandoned by the healthcare system and not able to get themselves off the medication after they acquire it. And there are all kinds of permutations of these different scenarios as well. So how did we get to this point? How did we get to where this is a really serious problem? Well, first, though this might be review for some of you, because you probably recognize it, we should say a little bit about what opioids are. They are basically a popular form of pain management medication. I believe oxycodone is the most commonly used one nowadays. Morphine is also very common in certain contexts, but oxycodone is like the thing you'd be most likely to get as a prescription following a surgery like what Travis had, or any kind of situation where you've got really, really intense traumatic pain. That's kind of the go-to standard medicine now. Obviously, a couple of the substances on there are not exactly legal, but they are still examples of opiates or opioids. They still have many of the same properties as these other drugs that you can get from your pharmacist. Now, the main problem with opioids is that they carry a really serious risk of addiction, of people, because and Travis does a good job of describing this in his book. The drugs not only alleviate pain, but also stimulate your brain in certain ways to create a pretty powerful chemical high. So when patients take these drugs, there's a really serious risk that they could become addicted to them if they use them too much. Or if a better way to put it is, if they take high dosages of opioids and then have to reduce their dosage, if that's not done very carefully and with some help, there's a good chance that they will experience withdrawal and go right back to using the medication in its high doses. And Travis himself talks about that experience and how he almost did that, and fortunately he was able to kind of push through and get over the hump, so to speak, and never go back to using the drugs. Now, this is complicated. This isn't just a case of, like, I don't want you to get the impression here that I'm just blaming the medical professionals. There are situations where patients will take dosages that are way higher than what they are told to take by the medical professionals. So that's an additional complication to the problem, and one way in which things can go wrong. You can have a patient who has a really serious need for opioids. They get the opioids from the medical professional. They're supposed to take, say, 40 milligrams daily. I'm not totally familiar with what the typical dosage would be. But suppose it's 40 milligrams. Suppose that they, in their own judgment, think that's not enough and start taking 60 milligrams per day. Now, eventually they may build up a tolerance to that, then they up to 80 milligrams, and that you can just keep escalating until they have become so dependent on the drugs, that on the opioids for their pain management, that it's going to be that much more difficult for them to give up that medication when they have, used it enough in the eyes of the medical professional. And then you also have the problem of people who have a prescription, who essentially just distribute it to other people who don't have a prescription. Obviously, that's not a good thing to do, but once people have that medicine in their possession, it's hard to prevent them from doing that. So here's the point. Whenever you prescribe an opioid to a patient, there is a serious risk that something will go wrong, that they will become addicted to it, that they'll give it to somebody else, or that they won't use it properly. So as a physician, you gotta exercise some kind of discretion as to who you give these drugs to, and be careful with vetting your patients. In other words, so physicians have to make serious, difficult judgments about whether or not they think the patients really need the medication to manage their pain, and whether or not the patients can be trusted to use the medication as instructed. But here are some things that tilt the other way on the professional side of the coin. So those were factors that might make doctors cautious about giving patients opioids. Here are some things that point the other direction, some reasons why doctors might be a little bit too willing to prescribe people opioids. Because we should point out that overwhelmingly the problem is on this side. So there are individual cases where patients who need opioids can't get them. But there are far more cases where doctors are too liberal in giving out opioids. That's the bigger source of the problem. That's why opioids seem so prevalent, why there are so many people who have the medications who wind up suffering from these adverse effects. So why does that happen? Well, here's one obvious one. Pharmaceutical companies want their products to sell. And as we will discuss at the very end of the term, they market directly to doctors, not just to consumers, but also directly to doctors. And they often will cut deals with doctors or even entire hospitals or medical communities to make it more likely that their drug will sell over others. So doctors have a certain financial interest in a certain way in prescribing opioids, or at least they can if they've made the right kinds of agreements. And so that creates a sort of perverse incentive to sell more of these drugs, right? The pharmaceutical industry is, just like every other aspect, every other major industry in a capitalist economy, a business. And the primary objective of that business is to make money. How do you make money if you're in the pharmaceutical industry? You get people to buy your drugs. So, doctors make arrangements to acquire large quantities of opioids to treat pain. There is then created an incentive for them to sell this, for the doctors to use the medication they purchase. So the pharmaceutical companies have an incentive to sell their products to the doctors have incentives to buy it based on certain arrangements they may make with these companies. Once they've got that medication, they are then heavily incentivized to prescribe it to patients. And when you put all of that together, what you get is doctors are probably in possession of more opioids than they actually need, and they are incentivized to give patients more opioids than they actually need. And that's why you see overprescription. And here are some other things to consider about the context we're talking about. There is a really, really, really tough and negative stigma attached to being an addict, or to being, as Travis calls it in the book, a junkie, to being someone who is dependent in some significant way on drugs, or unable to make good decisions because of your drug dependency. We also have certain stereotypes that exist about good medical patients and bad medical patients that can impact who gets access to pain medication. And so, I have some descriptions here, of course, on the slide, but I feel I should also point out that these good and bad distinctions often trace race and gender pretty strongly. So Travis has a hypothetical situation that he asks us to consider to kind of like motivate this sort of intuition. But when we think about the person who is a junkie, or in this case, a bad patient, a person who is likely just asking for opioids to try to get high, what does this person look like? What's their socioeconomic status? Most likely we're probably going to think of someone who is in poverty, someone who maybe looks a little bit disheveled, or is, in other words, really not incredibly well dressed. I think that person would be, a lot of people would conjure that person not as being someone who's, say, of white European ancestry. On the other side of the coin, the good patient would probably be what? Someone who's white, male, well-dressed, well-spoken, well-educated, has a stable job. Those kinds of generalizations and stereotypes make this situation even messier than it would otherwise be. It would already be difficult for doctors to use, accurate judgment in distinguishing, good and bad patients with respect to who's going to use the opioid medication responsibly. But this makes it even more difficult because if you are, say, African American, your chances of actually getting access to opioids is dramatically lower than if you're white. And also, if you are a woman, your chances are probably lower than if you are a man. Women's pain is simply not taken with the same level of credence or seriousness that men's pain tends to be. Last week when I talked into this microphone about epistemic injustice, and some of you, maybe not all, but some of you listened. Remember that one of the examples that referenced in the John Oliver video was about essentially a black woman whose pain was not taken seriously during childbirth, and she died as a result because the situation got too serious. By the time they took the situation seriously, it was too late. And a smaller scale thing happens here. If you are a woman who's in serious pain and requests opioids, you are more likely to be denied than if you're a man, because there are certain gender-based stereotypes play a role here, right? So the thought that women engage in more emotional reasoning and don't, they're overreacting in the moment or something like that. Their pain's not actually that bad. This whole backdrop just complicates an already kind of messy ethical picture, and it creates other reasons why physicians will use bad judgment in differentiating who they should give opioids to and who they shouldn't. What this amounts to is you've got a really substantial erosion of trust between patients and physicians. So if you're a patient, you're concerned that doctors are not really in it for your best interest. They just want to make money, right? So they're giving out opioids like candy just because they're financially incentivized to do so. And you may also think, so that's on the one side of the coin, but you might also not trust certain doctors to give you opioids when you really need them because they're too worried about contributing to the opioid epidemic. So if you have a doctor who seems, if you're a patient, you want to find this doctor that's like somewhere in the middle of these two extremes, right? You want to find someone that you think, this person uses good judgment and wouldn't just be giving me opioids for, financial reasons or for some kind of, interest of the pharmaceutical industry as a whole. But they would also be willing to take my pain seriously and to give me opioids when I really, really need them. Unfortunately, a lot of patients don't feel like they're in this balanced situation. They feel like their doctors are going to lean one way or the other. On the other side of the coin, if you're a physician, you're worried that a fair portion of your patients aren't really in pain and just want to use the medication to get high. And you're also kind of cognizant of the fact that you do have some obligation to the pharmaceutical companies that support you. Maybe not you individually, but your industry, the healthcare profession in general. And so here, so one of these, incentives gives you a reason to not prescribe opioids to patients to too often, and the other one creates an incentive to overprescribe. What this means is doctors are, much like patients, kind of trying to strike a balancing act. Patients are trying to find a doctor that is both discerning but also takes their takes their pain seriously. Doctors are trying to simultaneously weed out patients that don't really need the medicine while also prescribing enough to fulfill these sort of background commitments that they feel they have to these other pharmaceutical companies. What this creates is a context where, because those conditions so rarely manifest, you rarely get people striking the balance on either the patient or physician side between these two extremes. What you tend to get is patients just don't trust their doctors, and doctors just don't trust their patients. You have a complete breakdown of trust in the medical system. And when you have that, what's going to happen? Well, both parties, both patients and doctors, are going to be reluctant to disclose their motives for why they're acting in a certain way. Doctors don't want to outright say to patients, I don't believe that you're really in pain, and I think that you're just an addict trying to get his fix. And patients don't always want to be, totally forthcoming with their doctors, because they don't necessarily trust the doctors have their best interests at heart. So that just creates a situation where a lot of mistakes are going to happen. You're going to have situations where patients who really need the medication for good reasons are denied that medication. You're going to have situations where patients who don't need the medication, but who maybe are able to tell convincing stories or fit certain profiles of people who would normally be good patients, will get medication. You're going to have some doctors who overprescribe because of financial incentives, and you're going to have some doctors who underprescribe because they're too worried about being duped by patients who aren't telling them the truth. It's just a really bad situation. It's a tough one to resolve, but when you put it all together, this is kind of why we've wound up where we are, where you've got so many people in the country who are addicted to opioids, and as a result, not just suffering, not just having their lives made worse, but dying. Because when you overdose on opioids, there is a risk that you can kill yourself, and it happens. Anyway, I realize this is a very somber note on which to end this lecture, but I hope that gives you a little bit of kind of perspective. This is how we got into this situation. It's a combination of financial incentives lurking in the background, incentivizing overprescription, the consistent use of a certain type of drug to manage pain that has really, really bad side effects. And to be clear, it is really, really good overall that there are drugs to manage pain. I mean, let's be real. We're not going to throw out all pain management medication to solve the problem. That's not viable. We want to be able to manage pain. But second factor is that the drugs, opioids, have these serious negative effects. Third factor, gender stereotypes, racial biases, and other forms of unintentional discrimination that unwittingly give doctors reasons to favor giving certain patients opioids over others. And lastly, this kind of breakdown between patient and physician trust. That all of those factors working together is why you've got so many people suffering in various ways from either not being able to get the opioids that they need to manage their pain when they really need it, getting too many opioids and becoming addicted and suffering bad consequences that way, or lastly, getting the opioids, using them properly, but in some way or another falling through the cracks of the medical system and not being able to wean yourself off of the medication in a way that's manageable or easy, or in various ways feeling like your relationship with your physician has broken down and you're not really getting good medical advice, or you're not sure you just trust the person more broadly. Travis's case is closest to the third kind of situation, and you've got a quiz on those two chapters to see if you actually read and engaged with the reading before we get into next week. There's also a discussion board where you can kind of talk about what you know about the opioid crisis, answer some questions that I've posed. Make sure you complete that before next week as well.